Hello, I am Jessica Webb. I am an implementation coordinator with the Knowledge Hub at the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children at Western University. On behalf of the Learning Network and the Knowledge Hub teams, welcome to our webinar entitled Forced and Coerced Sterilization, the Ongoing Genocide of Indigenous Peoples. In this session, speakers will discuss the historical and ongoing practice of coerced sterilization against Indigenous people in Canada. They will also engage us in a discussion of the ways Indigenous people, activists, and allies are seeking to create systemic change to stop the practice by ensuring reproductive justice for Indigenous people. We acknowledge that Western University is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape-Wak, and the Attawandaron peoples, on lands connected with London Township and Sombra treaties of 1796, and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. With this, we respect the long-standing relationships that Indigenous nations have to this land, as they are the original caretakers. We acknowledge the historical and ongoing injustices that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people endure in Canada. We accept responsibility as a public institution to contribute towards revealing and correcting miseducation, as well as renewing respectful relationships with Indigenous communities through our teaching, research, and community service. Further, we also recognize that many Black people were violently displaced to Canada through settler colonialism and slavery. We will continue to work collaboratively with communities to challenge colonialism, anti-Black racism, and further forms of oppression that remain pervasive in Canada and that result in disproportionate impacts of gender-based violence on these communities. The Learning Network and Knowledge Hub are dedicated to providing learning opportunities that are safe, respectful, and inclusive for everyone. There is no place in the webinars for harassment or intimidation based on race, faith, religion, ethnicity, language, gender identity, sexual orientation, disability, age, appearance, or other group status. Please refer to the webinar safety guidelines via the link in the chat. These guidelines apply to organizers, guest speakers, and participants involved in our webinar series and any communication pertaining to these events. We are so honored today to be joined by Morningstar Mercredi, Nathalie Pambroum, and Karen Stote. Morningstar Mercredi is an accomplished author, poet, artist, researcher, social activist, producer, actress, and filmmaker with a background in multimedia communications. Her 40 years of activism and activation work are expansive, and a short introduction like this could only begin to touch on the breadth of her work and its far-reaching impact. In addition to publishing several articles, she is the author of 4 books: the first edition of Sacred Bundles Unborn, the second edition of Sacred Bundles Unborn, which is newly released, Morningstar, A Warrior Spirit, and Fort Chippewa Homecoming. Today, she is a vocal advocate for the criminalization of the coerced and forced sterilization of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people in Canada. Her activism as a storyteller is grounded in her awareness of roles and responsibilities, which she embraces with the utmost respect for her grandchildren and community. Nathalie Pambroum is a proud member of the Métis Nation. Nathalie is a founding member, former co-chair, and staff member of the National Council of Indigenous Midwives. They played a key role in building partnerships between the Canadian Association of Midwives and the National Council of Indigenous Midwives, focusing on self-determination, reciprocity, and humility. As the first Indigenous president of the Canadian Association of Midwives, Nathalie integrated Indigenous governance principles and prioritized a national strategy for equitable access, trauma-informed care, and anti-racist approaches in Canadian midwifery. A midwife for 20 years, Nathalie primarily practiced in Winnipeg on Treaty 1 territory, working with urban Indigenous teens and newcomers to Canada. In fall 2022, their family relocated to Victoria, British Columbia, and following the guidance of Coast Salish families, Natalie now works with another Red River Métis midwife at the Foundry Victoria Youth Clinic, the Victoria Native Friendship Centre, and Songhees Wellness Centre. Dr. Karen Stout has Irish, Scottish, and English roots. Karen is an assistant professor in the Women and Gender Studies at Wilfrid Laurier University, where she teaches on Indigenous settler history, feminism, and the politics of decolonization and issues of reproductive and environmental justice. Her research focuses on the coerced sterilization of Indigenous women in Canada. She is the author of An Act of Genocide, Colonialism, and the Sterilization of Aboriginal Women. And with that, I would like to turn the presentation over to Karen. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the introduction, and thanks for having me. It's a pleasure for me to be here with my two colleagues. And when I was preparing for this panel, I asked Morningstar what I should talk about, and she told me to say whatever I think needs to be said from my perspective. And so that's what I'm going to offer you today over the course of about 20 minutes or so. I'll talk briefly about what we know about the extent that Indigenous people have been sterilized here in Canada based on existing research, and I'll ground those sterilizations in a broader context to help us understand some of the root causes of that violence. And I'll end by offering some thoughts on the systemic change needed to stop the practice. So the coerced sterilization of Indigenous people is a practice that goes back nearly 100 years now. There was eugenic sterilization legislation in Alberta from 1928 to 1972, which saw about 2,800 people sterilized. Overall, Indigenous people were about 3% of the population, but they were about 6 to 8% of those sterilized under that legislation. In the last few years, they were over 25% of those sterilized. Researcher Yana Greco has told us that young Indigenous women were particularly targeted. She's also told us that Indigenous people were more likely to be defined as mentally defective, which allowed them to be sterilized without their consent. And about 77% of Indigenous people were declared mentally defective and sterilized in that way. In British Columbia, there was also a Sterilization Act in effect from 1933 to 1973. Evidence in a civil case in the early 2000s tells us that at least some of the 200 or so known people who were sterilized under that legislation were Indigenous. And we also know now that sterilizations happened outside of eugenic legislation. So in Ontario, for example, from the 1930s to the 1960s, about 1,000 sterilizations were arranged by A.R. Kaufman, the businessman and the owner of a rubber factory in Kitchener, Ontario, where I live, actually. Kaufman he's often referred to as the father of birth control in Canada, and he was also a eugenicist, and you can find archival letters written by him to different levels of government, arguing that to provide public health and welfare services to communities that are living in poverty, including Indigenous communities, but without also providing birth control was actually a waste of money and resources. In the north of what we call Canada, sterilization legislation was proposed twice in 1939 and 1941, but none was passed. But my first book, which you can see the cover of there, tells us that based on that research that I did for that book, up till the mid-1970s, hundreds of sterilizations were performed on Indigenous women from northern settlements. In any one year, between 12 and 21% of the childbearing population was sterilized in some of those communities. And the justification for sterilization in most cases was multiparity, or having given birth to 2 or more children. We also know at least 580 sterilizations were performed at federal Indian hospitals across Canada. And I say at least because information is missing on the Charles Camsell Hospital in Alberta, which was the largest and most well-known Indian hospital. And so potentially over 1,100 documented sterilizations took place over 1,200 if we include Indigenous men in that total. And these are in addition to sterilizations under provincial legislation in provincial institutions. And it's important to understand when we're talking about numbers that when you sterilize even a small number of people in communities that are already numerically small, we're sometimes talking about communities of 200 to 300 people, that sterilization rates have greater impact over time. And we know there were other issues, problems with informed consent, either no informed consent or forms not being translated into the language or dialect of the people, guidelines not being followed on when sterilizations could take place. There were also problems with interpreters, either no interpreters or a lack of policy on interpreters, or sometimes relying on high school students or cleaning staff in hospitals to interpret complex medical procedures. But most importantly, what I argue in that book is the context in which those sterilizations took place was one of colonialism and assimilation. And that includes Western medicine being used as a tool of colonialism. And so when you consider all that, it's difficult to speak of freedom of choice and informed consent. And we know, if you don't know, you will know more about that. More recently, over 100 Indigenous women have come forward with their experiences of being sterilized since the 1970s and as recently as 2019. In that year, an Inuk woman had her ovaries removed without consent by a doctor who since apologized for his quote unquote unprofessional conduct. There's now a newly formed survivor circle for reproductive justice, which counts over 200 women as members. There's proposed class action lawsuits pending across Canada, in Alberta, in BC, in Manitoba, and Saskatchewan. There's another suit proceeding in Quebec. There's also an individual suit in the Northwest Territories. And this is in addition to at least 2 earlier suits in the Northwest Territories and the Yukon, also filed by Indigenous women who were sterilized without consent. Thanks to now Senator Yvonne Boyer and Judith Bartlett, who conducted an external review in 2017, and they documented the experiences of 7 women who were sterilized without full and informed consent since the 2000s within the Saskatoon Health Region. And the review only dealt with women who were coerced immediately after giving birth, and they left out at least 1 woman who experienced coercion before giving birth. But their review confirmed Indigenous women experience systemic racism in healthcare. And it gives a very useful picture of how the systems of health and welfare working together resulted in coercion for Indigenous women. More recently, in 2022, researchers Susie Bazil and Patricia Bouchard released a report after speaking with 35 women who experienced coerced sterilization, but also forced abortions and other forms of obstetrical violence, with some experiencing all of the above in Quebec hospitals. And we also need to remember Joyce Echaquan, who died in 2020 in a Quebec hospital after she live streamed footage of healthcare staff hurling racist remarks at her. And it's since come out that she was also previously sterilized. In 2022, Holly McKenzie and her colleagues also documented the experiences of women from Winnipeg, Regina, and Saskatoon, women who spoke of coercion across multiple contexts, including community-based organizations, group homes, foster homes, and healthcare. And women described being subject to racism, pressure to submit to sterilization, abortion, or IUDs. And some being prescribed Depo-Provera without all the information they needed to make informed decisions. And in some cases, women didn't fully recognize that what they experienced was coercion until many years later. And my second book, which will hopefully be coming out in next fall with Fernwood Publishing, it looked at sterilization trends in Saskatchewan since the 1970s. And data from the Ministry of Health gives us the number of sterilizations performed on registered Indians. And the term registered Indians, I know, is a dehumanizing term, and it's one that's been imposed on Indigenous people to bureaucratically define them out of existence. And it's also one that leaves out non-status and Métis people. But based on that data, we know that between 1970 and 2018, so nearly over a 50-year period, over 10,000 registered Indian sterilizations took place in the province. And it also tells us registered Indians began to be disproportionately sterilized in 1978. That overrepresentation of registered Indian sterilizations, it almost doubled by 1986, when registered Indians were 5.9% of the population, but they were over 10% of those sterilized. And that overrepresentation was at its highest in 2001, when registered Indians were about 10% of the population, but 19.6% of those sterilized, or they were 1.8 times more likely to be sterilized than other residents, nearly twice as likely, with the highest proportion of those sterilizations taking place on women in northern health regions. We also know registered Indian women were more likely to have abortions. In the early 1970s, about 3% of provincial abortions were performed on registered Indians, but in 2018, they accounted for over 25% in the province. And it's extremely important to say that Indigenous women are as capable as anyone of making use of Western reproductive options. But more than numbers, my work spends a lot of time putting those numbers in a broader context. And it shows that changes to the Criminal Code of Canada in 1969, which decriminalized birth control and made sterilizations more accessible, and also allowed for the open promotion of family planning across Canada. All this was directly connected to changes taking place around the world at the time, in the United States, but also in other countries where corporate interests were exploiting lands and resources and peoples for profit. And these changes had a population control element. The expansion of family planning was considered by some as a cost-effective way of reducing government budgets by reducing the birth rate. And in Saskatchewan, as Indigenous people faced poverty and displacement from their lands, and more were relying on provincial services. My review of family planning policy over 30 years in Saskatchewan, beginning in 1970, shows how the systems of health and welfare regularly spoke of young Indigenous women as being at risk, and they approached Indigenous reproduction as something needing to be curbed. And each helped reinforce the coercive reproductive context for Indigenous women. So beyond it being a human or reproductive rights violation, which it is, the coerced sterilization of Indigenous women also serves a broader function. It allows government to avoid doing what's necessary to address public health problems in Indigenous communities, problems that are caused by ongoing colonial policies. And the scholar Alison Bashford made an interesting point in her study of population control activities globally, which includes family planning policies. And she says that by the mid-20th century, population controllers knew that implementing public health measures might contribute to population growth. And for some, this confirmed the need for death control, quote unquote, as they called it, or increasing public health measures to reduce disease and death. That needed to be coupled with birth control. But for other people, another form of birth control was useful, the active withdrawal or withholding of public health interventions to allow for quote unquote natural death control among populations with higher birth rates who were also living in poverty. Though I'll add, by the 1970s, the Indigenous birth rate in Canada had already taken a nosedive, with Indigenous peoples having on average only one more child than the Canadian average. But if we consider the failure of governments to intervene in public health issues in Indigenous communities, which contribute to higher death rates, including higher infant mortality rates, this can be considered a form of population control too, and that's part of the point that Alison Bashford is making. So the idea becomes one of reducing the number of Indigenous people instead of doing what needs to be done to improve the conditions into which children are born and to make sure that they can live long and happy lives. So the coerced sterilization of Indigenous women also serves another purpose. It undermines Indigenous people and the ability to pass on culture, and it's connected to so many other policies and practices that continue to affect Indigenous women and children in specific ways. But it also undermines Indigenous connections to the land by reducing the number of people who have continuing connections to those lands, literally by reducing the number of Indigenous people. And that's important to understand when the Canadian political economy, when corporations and even settlers more generally continue to depend on those lands for profit. So I'm asking you to think about how the coerced sterilization of Indigenous women and the failure of government to effectively intervene in public health issues in Indigenous communities, how they may be two sides of the same coin, whether it's intended or not. Both allow the continued expropriation of Indigenous lands, and both continue to contribute to an ongoing genocide against Indigenous people. So there's a lot that needs to be done to stop the practice of coerced sterilization, some of which my fellow panelists will speak to once I'm done talking, and I will stop talking shortly. But I'll end by saying that whatever's done in the immediate, whether it's criminalization and holding perpetrators accountable, whether it's investing in the return of birth to Indigenous communities, or whether it's ensuring informed consent in healthcare, broader systemic change is also needed, not only to laws and policies and practices that shape how institutions are run and how healthcare is delivered, but this also needs to include a fundamental transformation of the social relations that define our collective relationship with Indigenous peoples, that shape Indigenous interactions with Canadian institutions, and that lead to coerced sterilization and so many other forms of violence in the first place. Social relations that have to do with lands and resources, who has access to them, how they're used, and social relations that are inherently coercive as well. The inquiry into the large number of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls made clear that violence against Indigenous bodies is directly connected to violence against Indigenous lands. And the reproductive violence Indigenous women experience is directly connected to the larger systemic violence that comes from occupying and exploiting those lands as well. And the institutions of health and welfare have played a role in upholding those coercive relations. If I look back, going back over 100 years to 1918, George Vincent, the president of the Rockefeller Foundation, said that for the purpose of peacefully penetrating colonies and placating primitive, suspicious peoples, Western medicine had advantages over machine guns. And he said this in 1918, the year before the Rockefeller Foundation started investing in public health expansion in Canada, which also positioned medical doctors as authorities in public health activities. And the Rockefeller Foundation was named after the richest man in America at the time, who built his fortune largely through oil and gas taken from Indigenous lands. And the Rockefeller Foundation played a central role in the expansion of family planning policies around the world. Another public health scholar and the past president of the American Public Health Association, E. Richard Brown, he put it that Western medicine replaced religion as the intimate arm of the social order. And for Indigenous peoples, Western medicine remains a tool of colonialism. So not to pick on them, but I'm left feeling like apologies, like the most recent one offered by the Canadian Medical Association, aren't enough. The CMA was founded in 1867, the year Canada became Canada, and it was a central actor in the expansion of public health in Canada, in trying to ensure increased cooperation between many of those who would eventually become involved in the coerced sterilization of Indigenous women. I think the CMA, but also government and other health and welfare entities need to give up control. They need to give up taking the lead. And I think they need to let go of the assumption that their position of authority is a given, or that Indigenous people just need to be incorporated or better represented within these spaces on terms that haven't been set out by them. I think if we want to address systemic racism in healthcare, we need to address systemic racism beyond healthcare. And to do that, we need to support Indigenous peoples in their land-based struggles so we can address the social relations that lead to systemic racism in the first place. Relations of colonialism. Systemic racism against Indigenous peoples arises out of colonialism. The doctor who sterilized an Inuk woman without consent in 2019, he was found in violation of the Canadian Medical Association's Code of Ethics and Professionalism. He was suspended for 5 months. He paid $20,000 and he was ordered to take an ethics course, but he still practices in another province. This isn't enough, I don't think. Even if he was criminally responsible, this still isn't enough. I think it's past time for us to think about how we can support Indigenous peoples and imagine different ways of relating with each other and the land. And we need to start questioning the role of institutions that so many of us take for granted. And maybe we even see them as value-free or inherently good. When these institutions and sometimes people working within them carry out violence against Indigenous people. So I'll end by saying we have to remember Indigenous health systems are based first and foremost on ensuring healthy relationships with the land and broader environment. So people and communities are as healthy as they can be. So they're hopefully prevented from getting sick in the first place. And that might be the most ultimate form of preventative medicine. If we all help push forward changes to respect Indigenous health systems and broader sovereignty, I think we would do a lot to prevent coerced sterilization, but also other forms of systemic violence too. And so I think we have a lot to learn from Indigenous peoples. So thank you for listening.
Thanks, Karen. Merci for sharing your important historical and current day context for understanding forced and coerced sterilization of Indigenous bodies. Today, I'm Natalie Pembrin, and I'm going to be focusing on specifically some best practices for providers, but also as a midwife, I want to be able to highlight some of the transformations that are underway within Indigenous health in Canada. And I'm going to speak to the work of Indigenous communities and providers and some of the innovative practice models that are working to create some ethical spaces at the intersection of Indigenous health and wellness knowledge, Western medicine, and the healthcare services for Indigenous people. So given the complex history of forced and coerced sterilization, I think it's obvious that we need a response that is looking at the cultural, organizational, and systemic transformations that are necessary to address the deep and ongoing inequities experienced by Indigenous populations. So these responses, as Karen reminded us, need to be rooted in Indigenous knowledge and prioritize Indigenous voices, values, and concepts. And a solid understanding of the root causes of the structural barriers in healthcare and how they impact health outcomes is important. They set the context for how healthcare providers have to adapt their day-to-day practice to be safe and responsive caregivers. So if we're starting with colonization, I think acknowledging that the erasure of Indigenous health knowledge and practices has been and is a direct tool of colonization and assimilation. So when I'm reflecting from an Indigenous reproductive justice lens, the following examples sort of come up for me, like how Indigenous midwifery was outlawed and continues to be suppressed, how we have undermined and suppressed medicine people's roles and knowledge and use of traditional plant medicines, and the outlawing of traditional ceremonies and rites of passage that we know contain frameworks for relational knowledge and practice in the well-being for Indigenous communities. So, as Karen eloquently kind of brought forward, the government of Canada was that primary agent of change as the country introduced universal health programs and, the interesting coincidences around medicine and the role of healthcare in a lot of these colonial practices. Unfortunately, it did leave a lot of rural and remote areas chronically mismanaged, underfunded, designed and implemented without the consultation of Indigenous people, and has left a lot of people with very little access to healthcare and healthcare providers. And I'm bringing this up because the relocation to access reproductive or birth services has been the colonial norm for most northern, remote, and rural Indigenous communities. And I think it really does allow for this perfect storm of challenges and barriers to emerge for reproductive healthcare delivery, where we see, delayed access to medical information, delayed access to direct healthcare delivery services, language and cultural barriers that essentially contribute to poor health outcomes. And then there's just like the logistical barriers, such as like, the length of time that it takes to travel, the personal costs that aren't covered, the time away from work and family, the ability to have or not have a support person join you, or needing to coordinate like things in your absence, like around your family and childcare, are all like barriers to accessing medical care. Not to mention the fact that, there's often no relationship between care providers and patients, often no continuity of care. And I think finally, like one of the pieces as well is that healthcare navigation between institutions. So, whether it's the referral center, which can be like a hospital, maybe the community based resources that exist in that referral community, but then also what services actually exist within the community. And those gaps of knowledge are present for people receiving care, but also the larger healthcare team. And these cause really dangerous gaps in healthcare delivery and follow up. So, you couple all of those things and you add on the ever present jurisdictional issues of healthcare delivery between federal and provincial stakeholders and governments, sort of creating these Jordan's principles like all over the place, leaving huge gaps in the implementation of services, timely access, are just like some of those structural barriers that we often see. So I'm going to get into what it means as healthcare providers. So I'm going to start a little bit with a few brief descriptions. So what is sterilization? Right? It's the mechanical interruption or removal of part of uterine tubes or vas deferens. The goal is to prevent the sperm from fertilizing the egg. And forced and coerced sterilization refers to the provision of permanent contraception without true informed consent. So, as we heard from Karen, in Canada, this topic is relevant, particularly because of our eugenics history and the present day, like racialized, ongoing racism that folks are experiencing. So, there's a lot of healthcare scenarios where the topic of sterilization is encountered. However, the most common time for discussion is often during the childbearing year. And so ideally, these conversations are had prenatally over time where you can have discussion, you have time for contemplation, you have time to address questions and concerns in a way that aren't rushed. However, these discussions are still taking place during labor. Discussions at the time of labor are hugely problematic. So we'll commonly see discussions about tubal ligation during active labor or prior to going into an unplanned C-section. I don't know if I need to remind the folks on the call, but the physiologic stress, the influence of pain, fatigue, medications, the imbalance of power dynamics really do compromise free, prior, and informed consent. So sometimes a patient is also admitted in hospital for birthing, and they're going to experience multiple providers recommending sterilization until the family kind of acquiesces, like owing to perceived lack of power or knowledge. Other families have endured the threats of having other children apprehended if they didn't undergo sterilization procedures. I think beyond this, there's other manifestations of sterilization that I think are worth mentioning. Karen did touch on this. People with disabilities have chronically been excluded from the decision-making process around their own fertility. There's also many intersex people experiencing unnecessary surgeries prior to the age of consent that affect their future fertility. And then there's gynecological surgeries for like non-contraception reasons, where decisions are made during the procedure depending on the findings, where the patient was maybe unclear about the indication for the surgery, was uninformed about the available options or the possible outcomes, and then informed post-operatively that like a salpinectomy or a hysterectomy was medically indicated, but never discussed or agreed upon prior to the procedure. Sadly, there's also allegations of Indigenous girls as young as 9 years old have been forced by social workers to have IUDs inserted by physicians to prevent pregnancies, should they be assaulted or sexually active while in the foster care system, often without any follow-up care. So I think as healthcare providers and social workers, it's important to understand the implications of what it means to be an Indigenous person accessing contraceptive care. I think general distrust in the medical system is like a natural starting point for people accessing care. And I think if we understand and acknowledge the roots of this, it's the beginning of understanding about how our actions can contribute to the repair and to understanding the power of relational and trauma-informed care as a way forward. So when I'm talking about our role as care providers, we have to check our positionality. Don't assume that in your role as a healthcare provider, an allied health or social worker, you know what's best for Indigenous families. We know better or best mindsets exist. And usually this stems from a notion that Indigenous people are still uneducated or undereducated, living in overcrowded housing, living in poverty, and that the humane thing to do is to lessen the burden and hardship and challenge by adding another child or more children into the same family and household or even community. We have to stop presuming that these actions and attitudes are a thing of the past. A lot of Indigenous people continue to be marginalized, disrespected, and violated and harmed in the name of the Canadian healthcare system. Indigenous women and genderful people have a right to make their own informed choices about their bodies based on their own Indigenous values. So Indigenous people often don't know their rights within the healthcare system. They don't have a trusting relationship. And truthfully, the only way to change this racism is to build relationships of respect rooted in the following tenets. So patient choice. When it comes to birth control, it's the patient's choice and their choice alone, which method of birth control they want or whether they want to use birth control at all. I think where replacement decision making is being done, it's unethical with regards to the respect to methods of birth control. When we are thinking about language of choice, when we are asking someone what is their preferred language, this is a basic issue of accessibility, safety, quality, and equality of service. So yes, we need more interpreters. Support people. Medical appointments can be more comfortable for folks if they have the option of a support person or a knowledge keeper or a family member involved in the conversation. It can help to understand the questions or take notes about the information that's being shared, or to continue the conversation afterwards so that they can arrive at a clear decision. So, timing of the conversation, we did already overview that just before, during, or after giving birth is not the time for the conversation. It's medically negligent and it's unethical. And I think it's important to remember that a patient can withdraw their consent at any time. And in speaking of that, I think we have to consider the individual patient communication needs. So if you're initiating a conversation about contraception, like take a moment to check in, ask how the person is feeling about having the conversation right now. Are they feeling stressed about that? Would they rather talk about it at another time? I think like how we deliver accessible, informed choice, consent, and refusal, it has to be patient centered. So it might mean waiting to have the conversation till a support person is present. It might mean providing written or oral patient education at all health literacy levels to help with decision making and to respect UNDRIP's free, prior, and informed consent. Documentation, we all love this as healthcare professionals. If a pregnant person tells you they don't want sterilization, document it clearly on the prenatal record. Similarly, when sterilization is discussed, desired, and consented to, this should also be documented on the prenatal record and not be withheld based on race, age, parity, or social circumstances. If you work in a shared care team, ensure your documentation and your processes are clear between practitioners to ensure seamless care. We've seen it happen where, a provider has taken the time to have these great discussions, and then it's their colleague who's on that day, and they're all of a sudden not comfortable following through with their care providers team's informed choice discussion and are withholding services. So we need to do better. This is a coordination of care issue. I think we need to be trauma aware. So, being informed, coming to sessions like these allows you to sort of understand the history and the current day, like eugenics agenda, and the contemporary reproductive care landscape, and allows you to learn about how you can have these conversations in a way that can be responsive to folks who are maybe having trauma triggers, like if because they've either personally or have a family history of forced sterilization. So this like ongoing education, it's a necessary action. We need it for the public, we need it for the healthcare providers, we need it at the undergraduate level, postgraduate, and continuing education level. And the education needs to be decolonized. It needs to be informed by Indigenous survivors and looking at community strategies. It needs to include our history of colonization and oppression, anti-colonial and racism teachings, and it needs to focus on care that really embodies like healing-centered engagement, and it needs to also include understandings of Indigenous culture and language. So when I think about how Indigenous communities are restoring like protective health and wellness practices to prevent this violence, I think it does start with our Indigenous sexual health educators that are centered on a reproductive justice lens. And this ensures that, that information to our youth is coming far before a time even of being sexually active. and where we can know and have knowledge about our bodies and the history of what has happened. And when we have that good understanding of our bodies and of consent, we're better equipped to make confident decisions and know how we can get more information or where to get more information if we're not feeling adequately informed. We know that we need more Indigenous people working in the healthcare system who can, create the necessary change to the way health delivery is happening, that can deliver care in the language, who understand the implications of what it means to be from a particular community and the barriers and the gaps in services and how to navigate those to provide excellent healthcare. I think that as Indigenous healthcare providers and allied workers, a big part of what we're doing is ensuring a resurgence of, pregnancy, birth, and parenting knowledge that includes land-based teachings, that includes dietary practices that promote health and food security, that increases access to plant medicines and ensure the enabling environment for those relational practices within the community, right? That really promote that interconnection, that trust, that responsibility and accountability. We see a lot of innovative practice models happening with hospitalist midwife roles within institutions where they're doing a lot of knowledge translation for Indigenous patients. We're seeing a lot of rematriation of birth and health systems within communities and nations taking over and transforming child protection and weaving in those family supports. So in closing, I just really want to thank Morningstar for inviting me to come and speak today. And I know Morningstar is going to really speak to the bill S-250, which is proposing changes to the criminal code so that Indigenous women and gender diverse people can safely access healthcare. So I think that, colonial problems require colonial solutions, and obviously the responsibility shouldn't be left on Indigenous life givers to know their rights or advocate for themselves alone when seeking healthcare. But I think as an Indigenous midwife whose model of care is based on self-determination and informed choice, we know that changes to the criminal code aren't enough. We need Indigenous led practitioners, policies, and tools that prevent forced and coerced sterilization from ever happening. And this is long-term work. And this is work where allies need to recognize the leadership of Indigenous peoples within these systems. And I just want to end on lifting up and honoring the voices of those who've been courageous enough to come forward and who have kind of shown a light on this dark chapter of our shared history. And that I hope that you come away with a few more tools in your tool belt to be able to ensure the dignity, the respect, the autonomy in all aspects of healthcare, which include the right to choose whether or not to have children. And with that, I will pass it over to Morningstar.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, there we go. I just want to say that I'm very honored today to be sharing this space with Dr. Karen Stout and Nat Pembroom. My Tu peux le français? Je sais pas. So I'm very limited in my French. I'm taking a moment to ground myself, and in doing so, I begin with the honoring and acknowledging the ancestors and relations that have gone before us, that have, as a result, I'm able to be here today. I acknowledge the aunties, the grandmothers, the mothers that have gone before us, those among us and those yet unborn. I acknowledge the sacred bundles unborn that have been denied life as a result of sterilization. When Karen referenced the Charles Camsell Indian Hospital, it always pierces my heart. It touches my spirit because my late Granny Annie, maiden name Laviolette, married name Pichet. Her husband, my late grandfather, Jonas Pichet, they shared 15 children. Of their 15 children, only 4 survived the Charles Camsell Indian Hospital. Of the 4 that survived, my late mom, Rita, and my late aunt, Celine, were able to conceive and have children. Conveniently, on part of Charles Camsell Indian Hospital, and as is the case as well with sanatoriums and residential schools, documentation has been destroyed. So medical records that could provide much needed data and historical account of what occurred to hundreds of thousands of Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit children and women. I also need to start by saying that if by chance anybody who is watching this is triggered, I would like to encourage you to have someone who can be there with you afterward to debrief and to be there in a supportive capacity. Of the many allies and women that have come forward, and certainly the survivors, I am holding my hands up to you today to acknowledge all of what you've endured and overcome. I need to acknowledge and want to acknowledge the honor I feel and have and the reverence I hold towards and for all of the survivors, and certainly for Senator Yvonne Boyer for introducing Bill S-250. I also want to acknowledge and hold my hands up to and honor Attorney Alyssa Lombard, whom with Senator Boyer have proactively facilitated processes that hopefully will enable Bill S-250 to be passed. Bill S-250, which was introduced by Senator Boyer, has passed the Senate and is now in the House. There's a link being provided here to Yvonne Boyer's YouTube. And for those of you who may be interested in more information on Bill S-250, I would encourage you to look up the link that's being provided to you. I also want to acknowledge Andrea Carmen. Andrea is the executive director of the International Indian Treaty Council in the Southern Hemisphere, known as the United States, in the Southern mid-hemisphere of Turtle Island. Andrea Carmen in the 1970s, excuse me, spoke to the sterilizations of Indigenous women in the United States. I hold my hands up and I honor all of the voices of all of the women, all of the aunties, all of the grandmothers, and certainly my Granny Annie, whose life's passage and her ferocity of spirit has permitted me to be here today, because she passed that on to my late mom, Rita, who in turn passed it on to me. And I, in turn, have never been one to step away from the opportunity to act in a manner that is empowering. And for myself as an author and a storyteller and a poet, my acts of sovereignty have resulted in the publications of various articles and books and poetry, and I'm a spoken word poet, etc. The book in the second edition of Sacred Bundles Unborn, as you can see the cover here, Emma, Voyager of my community. I'm of the Treaty 8 territory. I'm the Wolf Clan of Kaitel Dene Slune, otherwise known as Athabasca Chippewa First Nation in Fort Chippewa, Alberta. So she's an up-and-coming graphic artist, and she is the person that created the cover of the book. As with all of the work that I've done and continue to do, I begin with the laying down and putting down of tobacco. I always ask for guidance. And I don't move forward without that, because I need to be able to continue to come from and convey from my spirit and my heart. That for me has been the most effective method and manner in which I've been able to convey in what I feel is an appropriate and respectful manner to honor those that have gone before us, those among us, and those yet unborn. When I speak to Sacred Bundles Unborn, the title itself was reverently brought forth in those moments of meditation and prayer, if you will, and seeking the guidance of the ancestors and the grandfathers and the grandmothers and the goddess divine herself. Sacred Bundles Unborn, the title of the first and second edition, obviously speaks to the hundreds of thousands of generations that were not, that were denied life as a result of sterilization. I think about myself and know that I wanted more children. I knew that I wanted at least 5, and I come from a family of 7 women. Well, my late mom had 8. Her firstborn was my late brother, who passed on shortly after he was born. And then she went on to have 7 women, girls. I mean, I think about my sisters and myself, and I think about the link and the fire that we carry from our mom. And it makes me smile, because my mom was a very feisty woman. Thankfully, because she had a lot to endure and overcome. I know that I wanted to have at least 5 children. I was blessed with a very healthy pregnancy of my son when I was 16. And I describe in Sacred Bundles Unborn, the second edition, I added a new chapter to it. And I talk about my grannies and how they taught me how to bead and make moccasins, and how today, as my own process of dealing with PTSD as a result of basically history, I found that beading and making moccasins and sewing as a very healing meditative process for me. I've made moccasins for my grandchildren. I've got 2 grandkids, and I know that there would have been many more moccasins that would have been made had I had the opportunity and was not denied the right to conceive. As an act of sovereignty and an exercise of sovereignty, that's where Sacred Bundles Unborn came from. The level of disempowerment that I experienced when I began to recall what my body, my psyche, and my spirit wouldn't allow me to recall until I was in my 50s. The impact of that was so great that I felt at that point the only recourse that I could take was to end my life. And I've been clean and sober now for like 38 years. I'd even thought about drinking. Needless to say, I understood at that point when those thoughts came to me that I was in crisis. Only I would not know to the full degree of that crisis until I found Terry Bailey, who I continue to work with to process a lifelong journey of PTSD. I've often stated when being interviewed by media, whether it's print, radio, or television, that I won't talk to what happened, and I refuse to, which is why I wrote it. And I encourage anybody who is interested, definitely read the chapter, and you'll understand why I refuse to talk about it publicly. But what people don't understand and aren't aware of, because I don't make it public knowledge, is that a part of not discussing what occurred, what happened to me when I was 14 years old, is that it pulled a thread, it pulled a string that unraveled so much trauma that if it were not for the ability for my body to compartmentalize, I wouldn't be here today. I know that. So when that thread was pulled, as if, anybody that does knitting or crocheting, if you pull at a string, it all comes apart. If you're not complete, your project, whatever that might be, whether it's a scarf or a sweater. I speak in metaphors. So when I became conscious of what happened to me and I started to recall, it wasn't only the event of what was done to my body and done to me. There's no other way to describe it other than I was butchered. The trauma wasn't only encapsulated in that moment in the hospital at 14 years old and what they did to my body and what they did to me. The thread pulled layers. And a part of those layers, and there were many, is why I didn't understand to the degree of the PTSD until recently. I just turned 61, so it's taken the better part of 50 years for me to come to terms with my PTSD. I want to talk very briefly about what happened to me after I was discharged from the hospital. I believe that I was meant to bleed out. I wasn't meant to survive the butchering or the abduction of my baby via C-section. My baby that was taken from my womb, that till today, I do not know what happened to him or her. So I left the hospital once I was released. I was heavily medicated because, again, I don't believe that I was supposed to survive what happened to me. And when I was released or discharged or left the hospital, 3 months later was the first time that I attempted to take my life. And in that process, when it comes to I really appreciate what both Karen and Natalie had to share in terms specifically having to do with the white supremacist racist attitudes that justify sterilizations that are historical. I make reference to that because the first time that at the age of 14, that 3 months after I was released from the hospital, I went back up north to my mining town community of Uranium City. And I attempted to take my life. I was brought to the hospital, obviously unsuccessful. I mention this because I've had a misdiagnosis of my mental health haunt me for the rest of my life. And this misdiagnosis was put in my medical file after I was released from the hospital on that January the 1st, when I was 14. And it basically states that they diagnosed me as manic depressive with person disorder, sociopath, asocial. I go into the hospital for one night and I'm released. And this is what was placed on my medical health record, which today is still there, which resulted in further let's just say attitudes that I never really understood when any doctor, for any reason, that I'd have to end up in a hospital or go to the hospital or seek medical care. And anybody was able to access my medical records and they came upon this. I then was definitely treated differently. So the whole point of that little anecdote or story or my experience is just to state that mental health misdiagnosis is rampant and it's ongoing. Dr. Ewan Affleck brilliantly produced the film or documentary, The Unforgotten. I was able to do the voiceover, and I was honored to do the voiceover for the birth segment of it. And in the birth segment, if you want to, I think they have the link for that, where I'm speaking in the voices of the founders, if you will, or the persons of the old guard in Canada and their attitudes. Those attitudes that are systemic to date and in place, those attitudes historically that have justified the ongoing genocide medically. And it's not just sterilizations. It's the misdiagnosis of myself individually, as I've put in the book and as I've shared with you here. I'm just one person. I am acutely aware, though, that there are other people in my communities, in my community and other communities, where practitioners are going into the communities and there are ongoing mental health misdiagnoses that lead to justification of medical malpractice, certainly sterilization being one of them. Though we're talking about forced coerced sterilization, and I'm making reference specifically to my own experience, it isn't just medical, physical, medical malpractice. It's so much broader than that. And it can be very overwhelming, not only as someone on the receiving end of this historically, but I'm aware, acutely aware, when I go into a hospital, for example, when I've had to often go to the hospital with my late dad prior to his passing in 2020, as well as my late mom, who also passed in 2020, often having to go to the hospital with either of them for any variety of reasons medically. The subjugation that my parents were received because they are visibly Indigenous, as I am, visibly Indigenous, was so heartbreaking. I literally at one point had to advocate for my father, my late dad's life to be saved because they weren't going to perform surgery on him. And I literally had to tell the manager of cardiac that if my father was released from the hospital without receiving the heart surgery that he needed, that I would come back and sue them. So the efforts on my own part and to advocate for my own human rights, as well as to advocate for the human rights of my late parents, isn't something that when I go into emergency or I go and get, when I need medical help, isn't something that I should necessarily feel armored to do so. Yet that is the reality. And if I were to say anything, as I was interviewed for I was invited to the CMA apology and flown down to Victoria by the CMA. They contacted me a couple of weeks prior to. And of course, I was interviewed by, I think, CBC television, national news. And I'm also an investigative reporter and journalist. So I understand the whole process of editing down the clips when you're being interviewed. And I let the person know that was interviewing me that I understood that. Please, if you're going to put anything out there, let it be that I'm articulate, at least in the perspective of what I want to convey. And of course, that didn't happen. Nonetheless, I was asked whether or not the CMA apology would make a difference. And to that, I said, obviously, no. And then I was then asked why. I said, well, we basically live within a medical health system that for the most part, systemically, historically, has been indoctrinated to believe that Indigenous, Métis, Inuit peoples and women of color, people of color, are subhuman. Subhuman. Therefore, justifying the medical malpractice, the death, the sterilizations of subhuman people systemically. So that's like a tidal wave. I walk into a hospital and I've got this tidal wave of indoctrinated systemic white supremacist racism that I have to somehow come out of, even though I'm there for help. I'm not saying that this is necessarily always the case. But when they asked me, Why is it do I feel that things won't change? Well, I simply have to state the most obvious response to that question for myself is what I've just stated. We are living within a society, systemically, medically. People have been indoctrinated to treat Indigenous, Métis, Inuit, and people of color as subhuman. And certainly for myself, that's been my experience, which has led to what happened to me and what's happened to thousands of other people. I survived. I survived from the sheer tenacity and will that was passed on to me and from the line of women that I come from. In the latter part of my life, I've come to understand that we as Indigenous peoples are a matriarchal society. We are a matriarch societies and have always been and continue to be. Matriarch societies that are within systems that are patriarch hierarchies. You really need to listen to the birth segment of the documentary, The Unforgotten, which also speaks to Charles Camsell Indian Hospital, to get the gist of what I'm saying. So I was saying to this reporter that interviewed me, how then does one respond to this tidal wave? How does a person respond to, for example, I have an elder friend here that, again, went to see a doctor because he wasn't well. And the doctor told him, before he even assessed him, he said, you shouldn't drink so much. Alcohol's no good for you. And that by far, this whole, that comment and the whole stereotype and connotation attached to that comment is rampant in Canada and on Turtle Island, and is probably the most easily accessible joke, anecdote, stereotype that people go to. Oh, those drunken, so on and so forth. So my friend, who was an elder and a very well respected and esteemed elder in our community, was told not to drink alcohol. And fortunately, he was able to find some other persons to advocate on his behalf. And the result was he was diagnosed eventually, and he was able to get the proper medical care that he needed. Suffice to say, he had to jump over quite a few attitudes and biases and stereotypes just to get the medical health care that he needed. So collectively, it's a tidal wave. Individually, I am in no position to say to anyone, oh, please, can you stop being so racist? I would really appreciate it. I can't fault anybody that has been indoctrinated to behave in that manner. I almost have to say it's not your fault, at least not in Canada. But that's an easy way out, because individually, each of us has a voice. And I have chosen to use my voice to speak to one of the most horrific events of my life that took so much from me that it's indescribable. And it's taken a lifetime to overcome it, but I have overcome it to the best of my ability. To say that I got over it, being sterilized, being butchered, never, not in this lifetime. So I also want to just say very quickly that when I began the process of empowering myself, because that's what it's been all about for me, is empowering myself by recognizing what was mine and what wasn't. Systemically, that's a little bit obvious, right? When a person internalizes this level of trauma, and you put on top of that the generational trauma, hence intergenerational, that's a lot. That's a lot. And I can certainly say that when it comes to my immediate family, and I'll just reference my late mom and my late granny Annie, that's 3 generations. I will do my utmost in my lifetime, and I have, and I will continue to do so, to do what I can to empower myself, because I am a matriarch. I am responsible for my own process, my own healing, my own recovery, to the best of my ability, of that which was subjected onto me, of that which was taken from me, and that is my ability to give life. That is my responsibility, to carry, to grieve, to live with. The rest of it, medically, systemically, we can only inform. We can write the books, we can have the surveys, we can do the studies, we can do the inquiries. But we all know inquiries and recommendations that are not likely to be followed through on. So it isn't only my individual journey, it's been generational. As a spoken poet, I've used my poetry and my writing as a means of empowering myself to be able to move forward in my life in a manner that is an act daily of sovereignty. So with that in mind, I'm going to share this with you. Turtle Island and beyond her shores. Void imprints cast on earth, lonely shadows lingering over barren, empty, desert, dry mirages reflected in a mother's tears. Grieving for her uterus, fallopian tubes, womb, babies not conceived, generations past, present, future. Wishes and dreams blown in the 4 directions across Mother Earth. Barren babies, never will they lay in her arms, nor walk on earth. They eclipse faded silhouettes onto ancestral, shimmering northern lights, watching over among ancient ones, reunited in spirit, only to be unearthed in dreamtime. Descendants denied descent from embryonic existence into earthly realms of fluidity, nestled within a mother's womb. There is no return from this place of grief for her unborn children, not on earth, nor in spirit. So back to those moccasins that I wanted to make for my many, many grandchildren. Just to keep it in perspective, I would have had about 5 children, I'm sure of it. And if you look into the future, and if I look into the future, and just in 7 generations, those 7 generations of sacred bundles unborn were denied life in their walk on earth. And wasn't that the point? Isn't that the most effective form of covert genocide possible, as inhumane as it is? So to hear from Senator Boyer that Bill S-250 has passed the Senate, is now in the House, gave me hope. And though it's often quoted as sterilizations up to 2019 recorded and that we're aware of, I would venture to say that as we speak, and I speak here today, that it's happening somewhere in Canada, the Northern Hemisphere of Turtle Island. Bill S-250 would effectively impact that and stop it. I think that's about it for me for now.
You're on mute, Jess.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you so much, Morningstar, for being with us today and sharing your wisdom and guidance. We're so grateful. We won't have time for a Q&A today, but we have your questions available and or we have them noted, and we can talk about having them answered in the future. So thanks again to Karen and Natalie for also dedicating this your time to us and this important work. We're so grateful. We also want to say a big thank you to our interpreters, Christopher and Joanne, as well as our French interpretation services by Carolyn and Sylvie. And then also a big thank you to the rest of the KH team and the Learning Network, Jade, Jasmine, Margarita, Annalie, and Jenna. We wish you a well afternoon. Take good care of yourselves, and we will see you next time. Thank you so much.